Hello and welcome to this video on fungal infections. This covers things like Candida, Cryptococcus and more that you may be familiar with. You might think of fungi as either mushrooms or yeast, but those are just two members of a much larger fungi kingdom. As with any large collection, there will be unpleasant or negative parts in the right circumstances. Yeasts and moulds are just the most common kind to be pathogenic for most people. Despite this, it is worth knowing that many fungi live harmoniously within the human body, but sometimes when given the opportunity, they will turn pathogenic. Fungi are not a concern just because they can be pathological, but because they can be hard to treat at times. Often infection is in an inconvenient place or somewhere that oral medication struggles to be effective. The most common fungal infections are in the skin, vagina, and oral cavity. It can also affect the GI tract, respiratory system, and central nervous system. The illnesses commonly observed from this are things like asthma, rashes, lung infections leading to pneumonia, bloodstream infections, and even meningitis. Fungi often rely on the same sort of mechanisms to infect a host as just about any pathogen that's, say, a bacteria or a virus. That is, a failure in the immune system. This includes something as simple as a breach in the skin barrier, like cracked nails, cuts, abrasions, and so on. Small cracks in your nail or the surrounding skin can allow the germs, and in this case fungi, to enter and cause an infection. Similar mechanisms allow for other places like the GI tract, bloodstream, and so on to be infected. Places in the human body like the vagina are susceptible when there are changes to the pH and other environmental or chemical defenses that the body tries to use to regulate pathogens and other microorganisms. The lungs rely on something like the mucus escalator effect. There might also be a shortage of macrophages or a very large dose of the pathogen. Unfortunately, from the respiratory system, one of the first stops for blood-carrying fungi is the brain, which, while protected by the blood-brain barrier, can only hold out for so long. Fungal infections are, frankly, an increasing risk when we talk about public health, and on a global scale, they are a bigger concern. There are millions of fungal species worldwide, and admittedly only a fraction of these are known to be pathogenic, but the issue is, they are everywhere. The second thing to be aware of is that most infections are only going to be superficial. That is, they'll affect your skin and nails for the most part, but some of them can get well and truly within inside the human body and cause much more serious issues. The common pathway you might find, other than those that enter through the skin, is respiratory. For example, if you have black mould in your house. An example of a fungi that takes advantage of this is C. neoformans. They are able to hijack the alveolar macrophages. These are the white blood cells that live inside your lungs to protect them. And when they are consumed by this, they then should theoretically be broken down and taken to the immune system so that the immune system can then recognize them and mount a defense. The problem with C. neoformans is that it is something that can live inside these cells. It's facultative intracellular pathogen, and so it not only survives, but it replicates. This means that not only will it be able to get inside a cell, but it can then hijack it and use it to hitch a ride to somewhere else. From here, it acts something like a Trojan horse, and it can be disseminated throughout the body. The immune system literally helping a pathogen. Of course, this is a high-risk, high-reward scenario. There are other mechanisms available. There are ways to do it as an intracellular mechanism, that is, having the fungi, C. neoformans, exit the lungs as a fungus itself intact and whole. Of course, this is a much more destructive and difficult process. Generally speaking, if you're going to talk about the C. neoformans in particular, the way they are able to do this is that they use that alveolar macrophage, and it transports them across the barriers within the lungs into the bloodstream. This allows them to get into the area where they need to be to move around the body. Once they're within the bloodstream, they can then go anywhere they need to. And As we mentioned, one of the first stops after the lungs is the brain. If it's not going to be hijacking the phagocytes that it needs to use, it may instead choose to use a receptor functionality, sort of similar to what COVID does with the ACE receptor, except this one's slightly different, and sits in a different family of receptors. By interacting with this, the fungi is able to move across the interstitial space between the lungs and the bloodstream and enter it. If this isn't going to happen, the fungi can also release a protease. This protease can begin to break down the cells, and this creates an opening for it to move into the bloodstream. Of course, all of these are somewhat of a finessed approach. The fungi in question can also go with something more brute force, let's say, and break down the tight junctions between the different parts of the body. That is where the cells butt against each other hard and provide a solid barrier. By forcing these apart mechanically or through chemical processes, it can then do the same job as if it had gone through an immune cell, had attacked the cells to create an opening, and so on. Once the senior formans enters the bloodstream, one of the bigger problems is not just that its first stop is the brain, but that it is preferentially deposited there. Specifically, it's preferentially deposited on the blood-brain barrier. This means that it builds up over time and it can break its way through. Once you have an infection, using this example organism, you now have a problem about treating it. Fungi are a somewhat neglected area of microbiology when it comes to treatments, and antifungals are available, but there's an increasing number of fungi that are resistant to them. There are really only 3 classes of drugs available to treat systemic fungal infection. These are your azoles, you have your echinocandins, and you have your polyenes. The azoles target your ergoestrol biosynthesis pathways. Echinocandins inhibit fungal cell wall biosynthesis, and polyenes bind to ergoestrol in the fungal cell membrane and cause lysis of the cells. Each of these is very effective in its own way because they target a very specific thing. With the azoles, they are able to target the cytochrome P450 enzyme called lanosterol within the fungi. We've mentioned P450 in many other different applications, and this is why the cytochrome family is so important, even within humans. By inhibiting this pathway in the fungi, it creates an accumulation of toxic sterile intermediates that should be going into the membrane in a final format. Once they're there, they provide membrane stability. Unfortunately, because they're not doing their job properly, you don't get fungal growth and eventually you get toxicity developing and death. Of course, if the fungi has many copies of this gene, or they're slightly different to what you're expecting to treat when you're using azoles, that's not going to work. Azoles have been around for quite a long time now, and they are perhaps one of the older ways you could treat things. Echinocandins are the newest class, and they target the fungal cell wall, similar to what your normal antibiotic does with the bacteria. They inhibit the beta-delta glucan synthase pathway, and by doing this, the cell wall loses a lot of its integrity, and when it loses integrity, it begins to break up. We've also mentioned that it can be quite hard to treat fungal infections. The reason for this is that, apart from the fact that they can acquire resistance, getting treatment to them in a high enough dose that passes through their cell wall can be very difficult. You then of course have the inherent and primary resistances, and because of this, you're going to find that fungi have a somewhat innate resistance to antifungal medication. Fungi do differ from bacteria in that they have been somewhat neglected by research into novel treatments, largely because most infections are relatively superficial and can be treated quite effectively. By contrast, bacteria have been touted as a crisis in the making, and admittedly, the risks of medication-resistant bacteria are somewhat more significant than fungi. It is still an often overlooked and neglected area, which may ultimately come back to bite everybody. With many similarities between bacteria and fungi, they are often seen as two very different things by many. Not different as in different organisms, but different in terms of what they are as a pathogen. Many will often dismiss fungal things as a relatively inane and non-threatening infection versus bacteria, and where a doctor may leap to try and treat a bacterial infection aggressively with antibiotics, the same may not be true of a fungal infection. This makes them both a overlooked and possibly very exploitable area of research to try and develop novel treatments. The difficulty, of course, with any novel treatment is actually getting it approved. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.